the core components of our business. So for me, when I started to think about this, it was very obvious for us what our core parts of our business are. And it's like, for us, it's our relationship with the artworks for our galleries. It's our relationship with museums, it's our relationship with auction houses and fairs. It's our ability to bring paying customers to all of these people, to be able to let them show that they can sell artworks easily, and they do not need to actually introduce more people into the process. At none of that time did I say how great it is that we have all these iPad apps and these websites, because that's not the core part of our business. And so for us at Artsy, open sourcing our applications does not really damage our business. In fact, don't need that really. It does not damage our business. The work that we do is about the relationships with the human beings and the corporations that we work with. So by introducing open source into our apps, we're not risking the core competencies of the business that we're working on. However, I do have one that is a little bit controversial. So we had, there's been 4 apps that Artsy has worked on. I mentioned one at the start that was the first Fresh project, which is a kiosk app that was built in Swift. But we had one called Folio, and this is what I was first hired to work on. It is it's really easy. It looks like this. It's a beautiful portfolio application. It's the sort of thing that galleries would take to auction houses, they would take to fairs, they would take it with them on holiday, and it would be the thing that they would use to show to a prospective buyer of artworks the artworks that they may have in the back room or on show and on an exhibit. And one of the interesting parts of that is that it's a pretty simple app, but it also has a lot of competitors, and a lot of competitors whose full-time gig is just building this app. Right now, this is my spare time project at Artsy that is not even quite 25% time to keep this app updated to iOS 8, updated to iOS 9. I think I did Spotlight search in the last month or 2. And so this was the only app that we had the real discussion of what does open sourcing this do and affect our business? So this was the app that we open sourced last year. It took a long time to get to the point of saying how easily could we answer this question? If we open source this app, someone else could copy and paste it and then start doing the exact same thing that we've just done. And that was an interesting collection of emails with the CEOs and the CTOs and product managers. That was, we want to be consistent within our applications, so we want to be able to say that we are entirely transparent, and thus every single app that we work on is entirely available for anybody to understand and see. But the trade-off is that if this app, it genuinely allows competitors to start businesses that can compete with us and could in theory be better than ours. I told you that I don't work on it too much. What could we do with that? Should we even open source it? Was the discussion we had. So in the end, the winning argument, if you will, it came from me on the idea that this app is simple on the surface, but much more complex on the underlying principles of it. So this is what it looks like. I grabbed it and I put it into Reveal, and I asked another programmer on the mobile team who had never touched this app, how would you write this? He looked at it and he said, okay, right. This bit here, that's a collection view. So I showed him, this is a collection view. He said, okay, so on the top, that looks like a title, that looks like a normal navigation bar. So, and I showed him, yep, it's a AR navigation bar. So this app could be prototyped in probably about a day, or maybe less. If you're just doing it all in a storyboard, you could probably do that. You could make something that looked exactly like this in an hour or 2. And so part of the argument there was that it's easily reproducible, but the parts that make it hard for us, the parts that make it the majority of the code base actually sits inside the syncing engine rather than the visuals aspect of it. So when we considered that the vast majority of the code actually reflected specific parts to Artsy's API versus the relatively small parts that were related to just visually showing these works, meant that it was quite an easy sell once we looked at the general percentage of where the code lies, that it was deeply tied to our service. And if someone tried to copy it, it would be significantly easier for them to just go and rewrite an app and just copy our entire design. And there's no advantage for them to steal our actual app than it would be to just start anew. One of the other things that came up in this question, though, was this is a 4.5-year code base that existed before Arc, but I think it existed before properties syntax on Objective-C. So it's an old code base that we don't go back to too often that still has a lot of old, crufty bits of code. And to be quite frank, I don't really mind that there's some old crufty code in there because it still works, and iOS updates don't seem to have broken it since it was first shipped in iOS 3 point something. And so can an old code base still be considered quality worthy of art? Was the other discussion that we had. And in the end, this one wasn't quite so clear cut, but we felt that the consistency was really valuable, and so what I ended up doing was actually having an audit of the code base. Myself, I wrote this over the course of a bunch of years with other people, and I created a text file called hacks.md that sits in the root of the repo that contains a list of, in my opinion, all the times in which we've made the trade-off of quality versus time in our code base. So rather than actively trying to hide our flaws with this application as an old application, I actually exposed them all very easily in our repo to publicly state that some of these things are things that we've had to do because our priorities were not always about trying to create the cleanest code base. Our priorities were about shipping applications. And thus, we could make these trade-offs, and whilst we're not proud of them, we're still proud of the fact that we shipped these apps on deadline, on time, and that is okay. And thus, our hacks file still stays. Every single app that we have, I think, has a hacks file that contains these kind of trade-offs, discussions of these trade-offs. So we shipped this one open source last, and that was my final ta-da. For me, that was the end of the process of trying to get Artsy's entire mobile apps open source. Whew. Okay, next point. Whew. Okay, it's nice blue, this one. It looks like the default on the back of the Mac. So apps don't always have to be, they don't always have to have the user's perspective in mind. Some example, I'll expand that a bit further actually. So apps can have suspiciously anti-user behavior. That's probably a better way of saying this. So an example here comes from two companies that you may have heard of. There was Path. What Path did was it would pull out all of the contacts from your phone book, upload them to their server, specifically so they could see if you had any friends that were using the app to make it an easier experience to do it. They were not the only people doing it at the time, they just happened to be the high-profile one that got caught. And then there was Twitter. What Twitter did maybe about a year ago was it would look at, it had a list of every single application's URL that it could be represented by, and it would then check to see if those apps were installed on your phone, and then it would generate an internal database of every app that you've got installed specifically so they can offer better adverts to you. And both of those things were something that Apple changed the API contracts specifically to stop these kind of behaviors from happening. And that's okay, because we had Apple to step in and say this behavior is not what we would like apps to do, so we're going to sandbox you in a way that could work better. So in contacts, that's you have to press OK in order to access contacts. And in the case of Twitter, that's some plist thing. But a harder one is the Volkswagen scandal around emissions. Now, you're wondering, well, that's coming up on a talk like this. But the interesting point is this interview with the CEO of Volkswagen at the time. And I'm not going to play it or anything, but I will give you a choice quote. I'll have to tell you because I thought it might be on the next slide. The quote is, "It was rogue programmers that created the issue around the emissions scandal." Rogue programmers. So this is head of the company blaming it on the people that make the sausage. Okay, that's not great, but it gets less great when you look at the fine from the EU to the US. No, this is from the US government to Volkswagen based on the emissions problems. And allow me to translate that into, I can't remember. Yeah, whatever your currency is called, HUF. Right, 12,608,577,607,208. It's a lot of money. And that's, so that entire problem is getting specifically blamed on rogue programmers, which monetarily is like that's obviously like a big number. I'm going to present a smaller number, which is a little bit more stark, but it is that it has been said that these emission scandals have already caused the death of 59 people. And the brutal thing about that is that the CEO of a company that has shipped lots of cars that have caused deaths is blaming all of that entire problem on a bunch of rogue engineers. So one of the things that working in the open can actually provide for you as individuals is that you can actually provide a way to route where decision-making processes came from. Eventually, someone had to have their name on, internally, someone had to have their name on the path feature that uploaded the contacts. Someone had to have their name internally on the thing that would generate all of the adverts, the advertising information for the Twitter app in order to send it up to them so they could send you better adverts. Someone definitely had to sign off on that rogue emissions scandal thing, and you can't see it, and you don't have any way of finding out who and why, simply because all of the work there was done entirely in private. No problem. So by being open around this stuff, you can have a better foundation for your team, and you can also use that to keep the team's culture great in the future and allow people to feel ownership over their actual code. So I found that was an important part for making a better foundation for the team that I'm working on. Okay, so I talk about how great everything is and how life is brilliant as someone working in the open, but it's not always that simple, and you do need to hide some things. For us, we have 3 main things that we needed to hide. We needed to hide individual keys for our applications, so that was our analytics IDs, our API keys to Artsy, our API keys to, I don't know, S3. Not S3, we don't upload anything to S3, that's a bad idea in an app. But we also needed to be able to find ways to provide different user configs, and we found systems for building that. We built systems for keeping that in check. We had the problem of, we wanted to have assets that were unique to Artsy, so we wanted the ability for people to be able to download and clone our applications, but we had things that we paid for that we can't publicly distribute. One of the biggest examples for this is fonts. So we actually went and found open source variants of the exact same fonts that we use that look almost the exact same. So our serif font is super close. Not so serif font is not so super close, but still close enough that if you're running the app, you probably wouldn't feel it too much. And you wouldn't feel like you were in a foreign app. And we use this by just building API compatible libraries. So if we wanted, well, for code, we can go over that one too, it's the same problem. If we wanted to work on a version where there was a specific thing that would just be for Artsy, but for the public would be different, we could have exact copies of the same app but with different behavior using, we used CocoaPods, but it would work on any kind of concept where as long as they had the same header file, then it would still compile exactly the same for open source and for closed. There's sometimes, though, great reasons to work in the dark. I spent a bunch of time working on an Apple Watch app, which I never shipped, but more importantly, it was during the first few betas of the Apple Watch, and I wasn't entirely comfortable that Apple might react well to us open sourcing like a beta 1 watch app straight away. And that's mainly because they're fickle. There's definitely been times when interactions with Apple have noted that our work is open source. And there's definitely been times when Apple have not wanted anybody to talk about anything that was in a beta. I think it was only on iOS 5 or 6 that people could even publicly talk about betas. So it used to be really difficult to try and figure out a problem when you couldn't even talk publicly about your problem. And so we would genuinely just do the simplest thing. We would make a private fork, we would work on that in the same process, we'd do pull requests on the private fork, keep rebasing from the main public rebase, and then eventually I would bring all that code back in once we were ready to ship it and we're ready that it wouldn't spoil our relationship with Apple. But it's the exact same problem if you had a release embargo on a feature. You didn't want people to know that you were shipping, Skyscanner was shipping hotels. You might ship that already. I don't know, some feature, whatever. You could want to hide it until it was time to release it. So you could do that by working on a private fork and then ship it back at the end when it's ready. And that works out pretty well. Okay. Almost at the end now. I'm driven by my impact every single day. When I wake up, I try and decide what should I work on at Artsy and what should I work at my open source based on the impact that I can have with my work. I generally consider it a little bit like this. I have me over here. This is, let's say this is Artsy. This is the open source community, this is the world. And don't get me wrong, I am having an impact on the world when I work on CocoaPods. A very large amount of iPhone users use it, or have it working on the system, and making it easier for anybody else to make something is a substantial improvement for everyone. And so I'm motivated by three major things, what impacts Artsy, what impacts the communities I care about, which is generally the iOS one. Sometimes people can be dicks, but I can live with that. And what impacts the rest of the world. Whew. Okay, so I've been programming for a decade, and the skills that I have are super valuable, just as the skills that you have are super valuable. Deciding what I do every day is about trying to expand the sphere of influence that I have on my day-to-day process. By working in open source, I can have a larger impact on the world in general. And that is what I want to do when I sit there and think, should I do some CocoaPods work, should I do some Artsy work? Trying to decide how much of that I should do on every single day is about trying to understand the impact that I have. And it's about committing not just to myself, but committing to the entire community, and committing to the community at large. It's not a simple task. And in the last 2 years, it's taken a while to get my company to work entirely in the open. And it's been something that I've been advocating for a long time. And more interestingly, it's got to a point where now I'm having conversations with large companies about ways in which they can release their code in an open source way, that hopefully by in this year, you'll start to see some big names moving towards open source by default. So for us, at Artsy, we're 6 months into being entirely open source by default now, and really it's never been a better time for our team's culture and the way in which we build and make applications. So what I really want to implore for everybody, and we're almost at an hour now, is one very, very, very simple idea, and that is you can open source your applications, and it is not going to probably harm you. You could do this. Until someone told me that was even something we could do, it was never even something I debated. And so, I'm the one coming to you now and saying, you can do it. People have been doing it. It will work out well, probably, If it doesn't work out well, I'm really interested to hear a blog post why. And let me know, and I'll do what I can to help as much of that process as possible. Thank you, everybody. I've been Orta Therox. I don't know about time. We're good for time, so I can do Q&A. I can definitely do Q&A. So.
Thanks. First of all, thanks for the presentation. It was awesome.
Cool.
So basically, the very first thing that caught my attention was the title. You specifically mentioned open source, but not free software. So I'm asking you, what's your take on free software?
Okay. This was an interesting one because free software free software is the definition of like GPL code, roughly. I'm a fan of that, but I'm also like a pragmatist. And like sometimes the two are difficult to. It's difficult to do free software in a commercial place. Like even as a rule of thumb, I would have to argue with my CTO that we should not use the MIT or the BSD license. One thing that I have thought about a lot was shipping our applications. We shipped them all under the code license of MIT and BSD. That comes with a trade-off. What may have been better to do it under GPL. One of the advantages of the GPL is that you cannot ship a version of your app to the App Store, roughly speaking, simply because what you are doing is you're giving them a version of your application that they cannot easily have the source code for because it's compiled by Apple, and you do not know what is actually working on there. There was a problem with VLC around this like a year or two ago, and so they had to change all their licensing. The reason why I bring it up is that what that means is we can say you can't put our app on the App Store. Like when I've wrote multiple open source apps, and 2 of them have so far been put up on the App Store, independent of myself. I know. So I have a policy now of like my own personal apps have been like MIT, and then at the bottom saying, I know that this actually breaks the MIT license, but you cannot put this app on the App Store without my express permission. The GPL would be the equivalent of the MIT plus that rule of thumb. But then I guess the other side is like, I don't want to put my app code as being GPL'd because it means that if I want to reuse it somewhere else, it would be forced to be GPL'd too. So I'm a big fan of the ideas, but it's not working for me in like a commercial context.
Thank you.
No way. Anyone else? So?
Thanks. I just have one question. You talked about that there was a big discussion when you open sourced the Folio app, and you say that most of the code is in the syncing engine.
Yes.
So the syncing engine is also open source?
Yeah, totally. But it's just like, thank you. Yeah, it is totally open source. But that is also built on top of a bunch of our libraries that we extracted out as like part of the process of open sourcing that application. It was mainly like part of the argument that this app would be hard to then build your own like business off because it's so specific to Artie's API that you would have to rewrite all of this syncing code, and then when you're rewriting your syncing code, you won't want to just use our view layer because there's not much code there. Anyone else?
So, what do you think about the Swift package manager? Do you see it as a threat, or no? Or do you think it will replace the CocoaPods over the years?
I'm a big fan. Like, I want. So I work with the person who created CocoaPods. Like that was not me. I wasn't the one that created the initial gem or do anything like that. But what he's always said, and what I totally agree with, is that Apple should have been doing this from day one. And when Swift Package Manager came along, it was obviously the way that, like, maybe in 2 or 3 years, most of us should be building our apps with. I'm assuming that they're going to add Xcode support. I'm assuming they're going to do everything else responsible to let iOS developers use it. And if so, I think it is like the duty of CocoaPods to actively work to make it as easy as possible to move from CocoaPods to Swift Package Manager as soon as it's comfortable for everybody. So one of my next major to-do lists for CocoaPods, I'm currently working on a Mac app for version 1, is to start thinking about ways in which we can make it easy for people to transition both their pods and their entire pod file into Swift Package Manager. Because I feel like this is a hard problem that takes a lot of our time. And we do it in our spare time, we do it on as limited resources as possible, in order to not individually have to end up paying for hosting for an extremely complicated website when Heroku decides they don't want to continue funding us because Swift Package Manager exists and all of our devs are using that instead now. So we want to try and simplify that as much as possible. So I'm a really big fan, and I'm we're actively involved in the building process to some extent. We get emails about the decisions we've made, decisions they're making, and how that can all work together. We're all relatively active on the mailing list for Swift build specifically, and I see it as an entirely positive thing. I'm really happy that Apple are actively involved in that space. I want to encourage people to be able to use Apple's thing so that it puts less work on us and we can have a nice stable thing and I can move on to building something new. Cool, thanks. Anyone else? Awesome. Awesome.
Thank you.
Cool, thanks. Oh, yeah, maybe you want this.
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. Thank you very much for coming to Hungary.
Yeah, it's good.
Thank you very much for all your work you've done for the community. And yeah, thank you guys for coming. And I think the next step is to go to Simplacart and have some beers with Orta, so you can discuss anything
Yeah, totally.
CocoaPods, RC, and being open related. And yeah, very much thank you for Skyscanner for hosting and Bitrise for traveling Orta here.
Yeah.
See you.
I have CocoaPods stickers downstairs, I think, unless they're completely emptied out already. Don't steal the CocoaPods coins unless you've committed to CocoaPods, though. It's not polite.